Welcome to Technologically Speaking. Alfred Marcus, Alfie Marcus. Some of you I recognize, some of you are in my class. I teach in the Management of Technology program and the Masters in Security Studies program. I'm also a professor at the Carlson School of Management. I teach strategy and business ethics, but not at the same time. It's my only joke. So this is I'm really very, very pleased that you've all come out tonight. I'm going to introduce Bill, and I'm going to briefly tell you something about the Technological Leadership Institute. How many of you are graduates of the Technological Leadership Institute in some form or another? A lot of you. So welcome back. And I'm beginning to see the familiar faces and recognize you again. We've all got older, especially me, so... the way I met Bill was that I listened to a podcast, a Barry Ritholtz podcast, and I think this is the only time in my life I sent a fan mail or a fan email to somebody who was doing anything. And he replied, which was just wonderful. And then I told him I was writing this book, and he'll tell you about it, I think. He was very nice to write a blurb on the back of the book, and I hope it was honest, but it was extremely nice. It was one of the nicest things that ever occurred. And so what he said that night was just amazing, and he's going to talk about it, I think, tonight, about the digital revolution state. I learned so much that I didn't know. I thought I knew something about what happened in Silicon Valley, but there was much I didn't know. So I think many of you know about Technological Leadership Institute. I think I'll go through this very, very quickly. We have 3 programs, and many of you are graduates of these programs. If you are not graduates of these programs, please enroll. We have degrees in management of technology, management of medical device innovation, and management of security technologies. And we also offer some short courses and graduate minors in the, primarily I think these are in the engineering school. And Bill is worked for many, many years and was a special limited partner at Warburg Pincus, and he really built, I think you would describe yourself as a venture capitalist, right? You built, you invested in many of the companies in Silicon Valley and have a very long history in Silicon Valley. And he's an economist by trade, but a very special kind of economist, the kind of economists that recognize that people are not necessarily rational, which I've often felt. It's because I take my view of the world from myself, and I observe my own behavior, which is not always perfectly rational. I'm not perfectly maximizing my returns. And his book, which I've also read, is a very, very good book about the innovation economy. It was published also by Cambridge University Press. And he's a graduate of Princeton and has a PhD from Cambridge University. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill.
Thank you very much, Alfie. It's great to be here. It's great to be back in Minneapolis. A long time ago, in the early days of my 35-year sabbatical from Cambridge, which indeed was occupied by first becoming and then functioning as a venture capitalist at the technological frontier, a lot of what I learned had to do with medical devices. And you can't be interested in medical devices and not spend time in Minneapolis. And I had many great friends and actually a couple of really very successful ventures out here, meaning that ultimately they got acquired by Medtronic, of course. That's the good fate. So let me talk about the innovation economy at the technological frontier, where progress is made by trial and error and error and error, where efficiency in the allocation of resources is the enemy of innovation, where tolerance of the necessary waste of experimentation at the frontier is required. And for those of you who've taken an Economics 101 course, the neoclassical production function is a very misleading lens through which to try to read the dynamics of innovation at the frontier. So I think of this in terms of three sequential, nonlinear processes: upstream, discovery and invention, often nowadays in academia; the deployment of the technologies that really matter through transformational networks, canals, railroads, electricity grids, highways, and of course, the internet. And then downstream, again, the experimental exploration as to what this stuff is good for. What can we use it for commercially to change our lives for the better, or at least to make a lot of money? All of these processes, and this is what's crucial, depend on sources of funding that are not concerned with immediately visible economic value. And historically, two have existed: a mission-driven state motivated by supporting national development or national security, and financial speculation, each of which can mobilize capital at the scale necessary to transform the market economy. This is what I call a three-player game. Three sets of continuous, reciprocal, interdependent games played between the state, the market economy, and financial capitalism. I know there's at least one physicist in the room who might recognize in this a metaphorical relationship with the three-body problem in physics, and that's not an accident. Just like the three-body problem, in my three-player game, there is no stable equilibrium. There are a variety of alternative configurations. In one version, state investment in fundamental research induces financial speculation to fund construction of transformational technological infrastructure, whose exploitation in turn raises living standards for everyone, dependent on the productivity of the market economy. We'd like to believe that's the only version. But there's another one in which bubbles and crashes in the financial system spill over and liquidate both the employed and their employers, generating appeals to the political process for redress and relief. Well, we've had some experience of that over the last decade. And then there's a third version where malefactors of great wealth, what a terrific phrase, Republican President Theodore Roosevelt's phrase, are able to exploit the political process in order to preserve and protect their exploitation of the market economy. My own focus as a practitioner of venture capital during that sabbatical from Cambridge, and as an academic since my return to Cambridge a dozen years ago, has been on the ways in which transformational innovations have been financed under conditions of inescapable, radical uncertainty about both their economic consequences and their financial returns. So let's begin with the role of the state. A long history here. One example being on the demand side of the market for innovation. The British Army, between the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the end of the Napoleonic Wars with Waterloo, the demand for muskets went from 10,000 a year to 2 million a year. It utterly transformed Britain's artisanal economy. The structure of it, the organization of it, it made Birmingham, England, the workshop of the first industrial revolution. On the other side of the market, the supply side, again, the American system of manufacturing, through the precise creation of interchangeable parts, was perfected at the US Army's armories of Springfield, Massachusetts, and Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. And of course, it's now a truism to remember that in our own digital revolution, it was the US Department of Defense that was on both sides of the market, funding the upstream research into all of the components of what became the digital revolution, from silicon to software, and on the demand side of the market as a collaborative, supportive customer, pulling the industries, the emergent industries, down the learning curve to low-cost, reliable production available for the commercial market. Now, I want to linger a little bit on the language of war here. When it is effectively invoked, you might think that the way to think about it is that it liberates the state from the constraints of prospective cost-benefit analysis. Whether it's a shooting war, World War II, whether it's the Cold War, or whether it's the war on cancer. In fact, that may be the last time it was effectively deployed by President Nixon in 1972, which led to the enormous increase in funding at the National Institutes of Health, which in turn laid the basis for the biotechnology revolution of the subsequent generation. But not all wars are successful or productive. And today, I would argue that the language of war has been debased, from Vietnam to Iraq, by way of the war on drugs. But nonetheless, the social return to technological innovation vastly exceeds the private return. This is work led by academics at the Stanford Economics Department. And the line in red at the bottom is the punch line, that the marginal social return to R&D is almost 4 times the private return captured by the companies that do the research. In other words, there's a social benefit, there's a public good, which in turn legitimizes state action to increase, to invest in R&D directly and to subsidize its investment in the private sector. So, if the state is not a legitimate actor, if the state is rendered illegitimate as an economic actor, innovation is all too likely to stall. I'm going to come back to that towards the end of this talk. But let me then turn to the role of speculation. And the first law of bubbles is that they are everywhere. Wherever there's a market in any asset, we will see herding behavior, prices decoupling from any relationship to cash flow. But not all bubbles are the same. Locus and focus. Locus, where is the bubble taking place? Focus, what is the actual asset whose price is being bid up under speculative mania? Is it the public capital markets where leverage is low, where borrowing to support and hold the assets that are being purchased is relatively low, or is it in the banking system where leverage borrowing is really high? Focus is the asset under speculative attention. Is it one of those purely unproductive assets like tulip bulbs, marijuana stocks? You might say that's negative productivity. Again and again, it's been real estate. It's been trading real estate. Now, there is such, and this is my prime argument here, we can observe historically the emergence of what I call productive bubbles, where the asset is one of those technologies, represents, embodies one of those technologies that when deployed at scale, transforms the economy, raises production and consumption possibilities enormously. And the way to think about this very simply is compare the great tech internet bubble at the end of the 20th century with the credit bubble that we barely survived when it crashed in 2008. When this crashed, the economic consequences were limited. They were well within historical experience. They did not lead to radical, unprecedented public policy. There was no need for it. And it left behind all that dark fiber that Netflix came along to exploit, as well as a host of imaginative, innovative startups like Amazon, which got funded to positive cash flow under conditions of the bubble, whereas in 2008, we were left with a excessive supply of beach houses in the Nevada desert, and an economic setback, the greatest that we have had in 85 years. Now, I'll give you some examples. I'll give you 4 examples of productive bubbles quite quickly. First, the British railway manias of the 1830s and 40s, the little mania of the 1830s, the great mania of the 1840s. The investment in building railroads tracked the extraordinary price, movement in price of the shares of the companies that were building the railroads. This, by the way, is the work of your distinguished colleague, Andrew Odlyzko, mathematician, extraordinary scholar in the history of British railways and British finance. I'm enormously indebted to him. He's been an inspiration to me, and my only sadness is that he's on a plane to Washington right now and therefore isn't with us this evening. But I urge you to look at his website if you're interested in this deep history. That mania, which, by the way, involved something like 10% of the non-agricultural labor force of Britain in 1847, it resulted in this dense, duplicative railway network of Britain's Victorian age, of Britain as the world leader in the first industrial revolution. Just after the British mania crashed, it was time for the United States. And in the 1850s, we had an enormous flood of money, mostly from London, to the United States, in turn building out our network in the Northeast, not quite getting to Minnesota before 1860. But, you know, you just look at this map, and in a way, you don't need to know a hell of a lot more about why the North won the Civil War. Because not only was this a much denser network, so that goods and people could be moved rapidly and efficiently, it was all standard gauge. This somewhat ramshackle, limited southern system had different gauges. You had to change from one, you had to move goods and people from one car to another car when you got to the end of a line. So it was a doubly productive bubble funding the US railways. Now, during the 1920s was not all about bathtub gin and the Charleston. The great stock market, bull market of the 1920s funded new industries across the board, from radio to aviation, and above all, electrification. And this, in turn, made electricity something from being a kind of rich man's plaything, where even companies had to have their own generators and motors and hire the few electrical engineers available, to where by the 1930s, you could just plug it in. And in fact, in the 1930s in the United States, from those companies that survived the onset of the Depression, we had the fastest growth in manufacturing productivity in the history of the country. And then more recently, the great tech bubble. This shows you a profile of the cash flows and the R&D spending by companies less than 15 years old in the high-tech sectors of the economy. And what you can see, it's a bit of an eye chart, but to summarize it, new shares issued by these young companies financed an 8-fold increase in cash flow and a 6-fold increase in R&D in less than a decade. Now, from World War II through to the 1970s, we experienced in this country what you might argue is the most constructive configuration ever of my 3-player game. Venture capitalists and entrepreneurs were dancing on a platform constructed by the United States Department of Defense. The state and speculators, in turn, were unwitting collaborators in developing all the components of the digital revolution, in deploying that transformational network, the internet, and in exploring the new economic space thereby created. So information technology matured by the time of this new century into a genuine digital revolution. And now, and this is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this lecture, we must address the consequences of this digital revolution. That's the theme of the new version of my book, as I always like to say, available at an Amazon website near you, revised and extended for the age of Trump and Brexit. But my first motivation was actually much closer to home. From my life at the technological frontier, I had internalized what I call the two fundamental theorems of venture capital. Cash and control. What does that mean? It means they serve as the joint hedge against the inescapable uncertainty of investing in new companies at the technological frontier, where both technology risk and market risk is part of the parcel. When something bad happens, cash and control means you have unequivocal access to enough cash to buy the time to find out what's going on, and enough control to do something about it. Repurpose the venture, sell it to somebody who'll take it off your hands, change the management. But enough control to fix the problem that you've been able to diagnose. Corporate happiness is positive cash flow? Well, that's simple. When you can pay your bills by selling goods and services rather than by selling securities, you've both validated the economic worth of your business and you've been liberated from dependence on external finance. I think that's, kind of a lesson that Adam Neumann of WeWork may be learning as we watch the saga of the IPO, non-IPO of WeWork. But both theorems, of course, were challenged by the unicorn bubble. This really motivated me. These companies burning billions of dollars at premium valuations were positive cash flow, needless constraint on limitless growth, funded by risk-seeking investment institutions, desperate for return in the context of negative rates of interest, negative real rates, and increasingly even nominal rates. And you have to pay the German government to get them to take your money when you buy bonds, when you buy German bonds. The monetary policies forced on central banks since the global financial crisis are key enablers of the unicorn bubble. And in turn, these policies are a consequence of the pervasively disruptive digital revolution at macroeconomic, financial, and therefore political scale. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought because I'm going to come back to it after a quick walk through these consequences, noting along the way that it wasn't just the unicorn bubble, it was also the phenomenon of CryptoMania, the CryptoMania roller coaster. Because these cryptocurrencies were being proposed as an alternative financial system, attacking the state's monopoly of money. Now, my friend Mark Blythe, who's a quite brilliant political scientist, economist at Brown University, likes to say, if you have to ask if it's money, it's not money. But the key recognition here is that both the unicorns and the cryptos were two examples of what I call the great reversal in the relationship between the state, and particularly the American state, and the digital revolution, which no longer needs state support or subsidy, but is challenging the authority of the state at multiple levels and transforming the market economy along three dimensions: globalization, automation, financialization. Let's start with globalization. The first great globalization at the end of the 19th century was also enabled by technology. It was the technology of steamships, the telegraph, the telephone. It encompassed free movement of capital, free movement of people, 1 million a year coming to the United States when our population was less than 100 million. Gross trade reached 30% of the best estimate we have of global national income. The second globalization, of course, was enabled by IT. The free movement of capital, goods, services, and work, if not labor, outsourcing. All of these a function of the deployment of computer systems crossing national boundaries. and in turn, creating Danny Roderick's of Harvard Kennedy School, what he calls the political trilemma. You can have deep economic and financial integration, responsive representative democracy, and an autonomous nation state. 2 out of 3. The state of Minnesota has deep economic and financial integration with the rest of the country. I believe it has reasonably representative democratic government. It does not have the autonomy of an independent nation state. Neither, as the Greeks learned, do you have such if you're within the European Union. So, political spillovers from the globalization, this is work out of MIT, pointing out how looking at congressional districts in terms of the proportion of imports coming from China after China joined the World Trade Organization showed a definite polarization, political polarization in their politics. But globalization, once again, has been complemented by the automation of work. Once again, as with the rise of the factory at the start of the 19th century, the invention of the production line at the start of the 20th century, technology is transforming both the content of work, and this is one of many estimates of how many existing jobs are exposed to automation, but it's also transforming the management of work, not just for gig workers, but for workers at Walmart and at Starbucks. And again, political spillover from the impact of automation. This is a very narrow and limited exercise in economic research that showed some material shift in the voting for Republican candidate for president between 2012 and 2016 as a function of the number of robots in the particular geographical areas. And then finally, financialization of economic life generated the greatest discontinuous shock of the digital age. This is actually a chart that's pretty easy to read. This is the ratio of the total value of financial assets in the United States to GDP, to national income, what you might say is the underlying cash flows that are available to support the valuation of the financial assets. From early 1950s to 1980, that ratio goes from 1.3 to 1.8 times. If you were doing the compound growth rate, it's trivial, it's tiny, certainly easy to absorb. But from 1980 to 2007, goes from 1.8 to 4.8 times. This financialization of the economy was made possible by IT. It was IT that made it possible, computerization, to create, first, the securitized instruments for mortgages, accounts receivable, credit cards, student debt, that turned these loans, which historically had been held to maturity by the lenders, into tradable securities, which in turn created the possibility for writing derivatives on them, securities whose value would be a function of the movement and the value of the securitized securities. There's a reason that Warren Buffett called these financial weapons of mass destruction, because it also went with the globalization of finance at an unprecedented scale. International bank claims, the claims that banks have, short-term claims on other banks across international lines. You have these 6 areas of the world, the ones that really matter are the US and Europe. The thickness of the line tells you how much is at risk. You may not be able to see it, but I'll tell you. But US claims on European banks. In other words, European banks owed US banks about $500 billion in 2002. Only 5 years later, it was $1.6 trillion, increased by a factor of 3. And vice versa, European claims on US banks owed European banks $1 trillion in 2002. 5 years later, it was $2.6 trillion. This is how the digital revolution allowed an embarrassment in the subprime mortgage sector of the American economy to produce the greatest global financial crisis since 1931 to 33. Now, two books. First, Adam Tooze. It's not just Alfie's book that I like to promote. Adam Tooze is a historian at Columbia who's produced what I think will go down as the best analytical account of the sources and response to the global financial crisis. Next to it, I have Jesse Eisenberg's book with the best title of any serious book published in 2018. It explains the greatest policy failure in response to the global financial crisis. Outside of Iceland and Ireland, no financial executives who presided over the global financial crisis were even indicted. 25 years before, under a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, in the consequences of the much minor savings and loan crisis, 200 bankers went to jail. It is understandable that the political response has been one of, let us say, a degree of anger. And it's not the first time it's happened. This is a study of the political consequences of financial crises, and what it shows is the increase of the vote for far-right parties in the years following a financial crisis. This is across the world. It's broken down between pre-World War II and post-World War II, but the pattern is very similar. So 10 years after the global financial crisis, executive leadership across all the market economies is failing the challenges, globalization, automation, financialization, generated by that revolution. And so the leading central banks have been the only game in town, as Mohamed El-Arian, very fine economist, and a Cambridge man, I may say, put it. They've been driven to support economic growth through negative real interest rates and unconventional purchases of debt. This is the thought I ask you to hold, because in doing so, these central banks created the unprecedented environment for the unicorn bubble and for sustaining cash flows and valuation of financial assets, even under the conditions of a relatively slow, and in Europe, much more so than the US, frustratingly slow recovery from the financial crisis. So how did we get here? How do we get to this point of frustration with government, failure of government? How did we get to a point where the state, which had played this extraordinarily innovative role, is now its authority challenged, and even the integrity of the political process on which that authority rests being undermined through the consequences of this digital revolution? Well, I would argue that ideas matter. Ideas really matter. Now, in 1943, remarkable man, Friedrich Hayek, writing from the depths of World War II, responding to the two tyrannies of the left, the Soviet Union, Stalin, and the right, Nazi Germany, Hitler, wrote the book, The Road to Serfdom, which argued that any step down the path of government direct engagement in the economy would inevitably result in that kind of tyranny. In the United States, that message was somewhat moderated, but publicly celebrated by Milton Friedman, one of the greatest publicists as economist in the history of the profession. And his television series in 1980, Free to Choose, and the book that accompanied it, was the kind of opener. It was a kind of curtain raiser for Ronald Reagan's first inaugural in 1981, when he famously said, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." Now, this perspective, coming off the history from World War II through the Cold War of the constructive role of government in the economy, this view was aligned with powerful interests from the market economy, but it was also rationalized by a generation of economic theory captured in two formulations: the efficient markets hypothesis and the rational expectations hypothesis. From the inside of the discipline, you might say that the efficient allocation of resources, that is the fundamental virtue that we should look for. And it basically ate the distribution of income and the state role in stabilizing the economy. They vanished as objects of study, let alone as objects of policy. The political message was very simple. Left alone, markets will deliver an efficient, fair, stable outcome. Now, I've argued that that perspective is radically misleading for the economics of innovation, but it also proved to be destructive for the political economies of the West. And in fact, with historic irony in this context, we've all been unwitting beneficiaries of the power of institutional inertia, the holdover from history despite what had become common wisdom and dominant political policy thinking, not just in the Reagan administration, but also in the Clinton administration. Because in fact, I'm going to walk you through this chart. The structure, the institutional structure of the economies of the developed countries had all been transformed over the previous generation. So this is state expenditures as a percentage of national income for the top four countries: Britain, the United States, Germany, and Japan. Now, there are two spikes. Guess what? Those are the world wars. Back here in 1929, in the US, 7% of national income was represented by public sector spending. 5% of that was at state and local level, where by their own constitutions, as tax revenues fell with the Depression, they had to cut the spending. 2% was the federal government. It actually rose to 4% under President Herbert Hoover because national income declined by 50%. Not quite the way you would like to have it. Now, this time around, and this is the important point, this time around, the public sector was 35 to 50%. 35% in the US, 50% in parts of Western Europe. Big enough to buffer the private sector when the banks froze. The banks stopped lending, but the Social Security checks kept flowing. It provided an enormous offset, a moderating balance wheel for the private sector. So today, the US economy represents a kind of paradox. On the one hand, undoubtedly, we remain the leaders in the digital revolution. We're the home of the FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google. You could throw reborn Microsoft in it. The superstar firms, as David Autor at MIT says, had real macro consequences. They have shown enormous increase in the profitability available to those who come to dominate their markets. And that's also been revealed in the historic decline in the share of revenues from these companies revenues across the private sector going to labor versus going to capital. And it's been driven by a new source of market power, additional to what we're taught in school, additional to economies of scale, economies of scope, network effects. Data is the new source of market power. The more data, the better the algorithms. The better the algorithms, the better the service being offered. The better the service, the more users. The more users, the more data. And so the cycle of positive feedback proceeds. But this stands out. These extraordinary, successful stories, incredible, stand out in an economy which has all sorts of symptoms of reduced economic dynamism. Industry concentration and profit margins are up across all sectors. The number of public companies has declined by 50% since 2000. That's partly a function of much fewer IPOs, down about 1/3 of the rate that was reasonably stable from 1980 to 2000. It's also a function of go private and by private equity. It's also a function, of course, of merger and acquisition activity in a context of very reduced antitrust enforcement. Social and economic mobility is down. The proportion of people at the age of 30 whose incomes are higher than their parents were at the age of 30 has declined from approaching 90% in the early post-war years, where, of course, you're comparing with the Depression, to under 50% today. And financial short-termism, with the need to meet the index, and with companies motivated to respond to their investors' short-term interests, shifting research more towards short-term projects than the long-term risky projects that once upon a time companies like AT&T through its Bell Labs had. This has gone along with the return of inequality to the levels that had not been seen since certainly 1929, or really before at the end of the 19th century. Now, it's a function of multiple forces. One is the skill-biased technical change that comes with digital automation. Another is the sheer scale of the financial sector, where incomes are very high. Of course, it's been not reversed by tax cuts, it's actually been increased by a series of regressive tax cuts. But it's delegitimized, the delegitimized states in the West, and it's not just the United States, have failed to respond. We can read it in the emergence of the extreme right-wing parties across all of Western Europe, the AfD in Germany. We can see it in the bitter debate over Brexit in the United Kingdom. And it's coming with these governments that are relatively paralyzed, it seems, at a time when the digital revolution has matured so far, it doesn't need any support, as I've said. But there's a new technological revolution that's urgently required. The Cold War, if it hadn't happened, if the Defense Department had never been created in 1947, if Stalin had died in his bed in 1945 and there'd never been a Korean War and no Cold War, the digital evolution would still have occurred. It would have been much more gradual. It would not have created enormous fortunes along the way. It would have been much less disruptive to employment and to existing companies driven out of business. But this time around, climate change won't wait. Climate change won't wait, and it still requires radical innovation, above all in battery storage technology or alternative storage technologies. But this time around, the US has abdicated. Now, China has asserted a determination to lead while it's still building coal-fired power plants, although it has the benefit of German subsidies to business and homeowners creating the kind of demand that the Defense Department did for semiconductors. But in this case, it pulled China down the learning curve to being the global low-cost producer of solar panels. Rather perverse consequence for Germany, some benefit to the world at large. But to consider China as the leader at the technological frontier, asking that question to me means revisiting from scratch the three-player game that I described when I began. From the late 18th century through the next 200 years, the industrialization of market capitalism empowered merchants and artisans, proletarians and peasants. Representative democracy emerged as the political counterweight to market capitalism. This coexistence has been recent in the history of humanity, fragile, fraught, and problematic. It broke down 80 years ago in most of Western Europe. It came close to breaking down in the United States. It's always been subject to reciprocal rent-seeking across the membrane that separates the public and private sectors. Now again under growing stress. But China's proposed alternative, what I call the not-so-benevolent surveillance state, yeah, it's technically capable of identifying protests emerging from abuse in the market economy and creating the opportunity for the state to respond before public anger threatens the legitimacy of the state. But of course, the state can respond by correcting the causes of the protest, or it can respond by crushing the protesters. And the Chinese leadership is if you read their speeches, if you read their papers, they're very thoughtful, very thoughtful. And they're clearly aware of a kind of existential conflict. This was the last great, the 19th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping established unequivocally his role at the top of the Chinese hierarchy. And on the one hand, he recognized the people are demanding. Their demands for democracy, rule of law, fairness and justice, and a better environment, they're increasing. We recognize that. But then he went on to say, every one of us in the leadership of the country must re-emphasize our commitment to the party, to party control, to party discipline. That is an existential conflict. And of course, there's a follow-on question, which is 2,000 years old. Anybody read Latin here? Quis custodes ipsos custodiet? Who shall guard the guardians themselves? That was Juvenal, written about 2,000 years ago in Rome. So, like all following nations, China faces enormous challenges. To go from effective follower to innovative leader, all followers, let's be clear, all followers appropriate whatever intellectual property they can get their hands on. The British took textile technology, the first industry of the Industrial Revolution, from India and Italy. We took it from the British. The entire American textile industry was based on stolen intellectual property. And Fall River, Massachusetts in 1850 produced more textile goods than Manchester. But along the way, as I say, this public-private corruption engine has doomed more followers by far than have ever succeeded in getting anywhere close to the frontier. I will say the Chinese clearly recognize that in their war on corruption. The US finally did, and after the Civil War, when we finally created a reasonably clean civil service and cleaned up the corruption that had involved people with satchels literally buying votes on the floor of the United States Senate for the train routes, the railway routes that would get the land grants. Corruption was endemic. So for China, as for all, in any case, the three-player game with Chinese characteristics is as indeterminate as that three-body problem in physics. So let me conclude with recognition that this is a fairly dark picture, at least from an American perspective. And, when I was hired at Warburg Pincus 31 years ago, the fellow who hired me said, you can't survive as a venture capitalist if you're a pessimist. The first time you lose a startup, you'll slit your throat and you'll be out of the game. So I am a temperamental optimist, and my primary source of optimism in the midst of all this dismay is that ideas still do matter. And the global financial crisis, it turns out, has been the gift that keeps on giving to the disciplines of economics and finance. First of all, it's forced a reunion between those two disciplines, an understanding that from micro to macro, what happens in the financial markets, what happens in the financial system, feeds back and interacts with what's going on in the real economy, where people go to work, where people start companies, where people try to pay their bills. It's forced recognition of the behavioral foundations, not the fantasy of the perfectly rational, as Alfie was decrying, the perfectly rational, optimizing representative agent who knows the full consequences of all of her decisions well in advance and can choose the best of them. None of us live like that. None of us can live like that. And it's forced a return, a very observable return in the journals, to evidence first, empirical research first, theory second. And I cite two more books. These are from the twin citadels of New Cambridge, Cambridge, Massachusetts. From MIT, Andrew Lo, great financial economist, and from Harvard, Andrei Schleifer is the senior author, although his name comes second, again, a very senior economist at Harvard. Both of these attack those dogmas of efficient markets and rational expectations that jointly delegitimize the state. And they are part of the general movement that's brought distribution and stabilization as subjects of research and of policy back on the agenda. In fact, fiscal policy as an instrument of active state support for the economy is being rediscovered. In Europe, in a rather intellectually coherent way, Christine Lagarde was the head of the IMF. She's about to become head of the European Central Bank. Mario Draghi is the current head of the European Central Bank. They're both basically addressing Germany, which has recovered through massive trade surpluses, but has absolutely resisted any effort to provide fiscal support, spending and borrowing support for economic growth, forcing the central banks to drive interest rates so low. In the US, it's kind of returned in a sort of, I might say, characteristically Trumpistic incoherence. But I'll finish there by citing Kay. I just want to make one note. This is an addition. I want to make one note for all of us who are continuing to watch the sagas of Tesla and Uber and Lyft and WeWork. If active fiscal policy does become practical, it will have financial consequences. As and when central banks are free to normalize interest rates, all financial assets will be repriced downwards. When you're discounting the future, particularly the most speculative of futures, at a higher discount rate, the net present value declines. It declines exponentially. So, most of all, the assets of the most speculative companies, the share prices will be adjusted. And it happens, of course, this would occur when the unicorns are already subject to skeptical public scrutiny. But at the end of the day, Keynes, at the end of his general theory, Keynes wrote, "The power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas." Indeed, the ideas of Hayek and Friedman, their power was enormous. Sooner or later, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. It may take a further generation from where we are now, and we're 10 years into that generation already, but when the ideas that are now being developed in schools of economics and schools of finance that are coming into the business schools, when these ideas inform the space for public policy, I am utterly confident they will be powerful for good. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.